Hey guys, tonight we step into one of those strange tales that history loves to whisper when the lights dim. Picture Constantinople, the grand capital of the Byzantine Empire, a city of walls so massive that armies bounced off them like clumsy children against a stone gate, a city of domes that glinted with gold mosaics even under grey skies. Now imagine walking into its marketplace, the Forum, where merchants once hawked silks, spices, olive oil and gossip, and finding it utterly silent. Not just quiet, but emptied of sellers and buyers. The wooden stalls bear the coins missing their familiar clatter. It is the kind of sight that makes your stomach flip. A city without its market is like a body without a heartbeat, and Constantinople without voices or bargaining hands is almost unthinkable. If you ever stumble onto something like that, by the way, you probably won't survive long enough to puzzle it out. Markets are where food and water flow, and if those are gone, so is your luck. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and local time in the comments below. It always amazes me how far this little corner of storytelling can stretch. Now find yourself a cozy seat or a soft bed, let your mind begin to unwind, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of Constantinople's empty market begins like all the best mysteries with a contradiction. The city was the bustling crossroads of the medieval world, where caravans from Asia met galleys from the Mediterranean, where merchants of Venice and Genoa fought over stalls with Armenian traders and Arab spice dealers. The Byzantine market wasn't just a place to haggle over figs or buy lamps, it was the economic heartbeat of an empire. Yet several chronicles, frustratingly vague as medieval chronicles, love to be hint at an incident where the marketplace opened to eerie silence. No sellers, no buyers, just empty benches and a few stray cats licking their paws on stone steps. Mainstream fact anchors us here. Constantinople's population at its peak reached perhaps 500,000 people, dwarfing most cities of Europe at the time. To imagine such a place with a deserted marketplace is almost absurd, yet the rumour persisted, slipping through the centuries like smoke through a cracked dome. Some sources describe a famine that caused food stalls to stand bare, others a plague that swept vendors away, and still others whisper of political edicts that cleared the square in a single night. Historians still argue whether these fragments refer to a single dramatic event, or whether later writers compress several smaller crises into one ghostly story of emptiness. The setting adds to the unease. Constantinople's Forum wasn't just stone and stalls, it was layered with meaning. Statues of emperors stood watch, triumphal columns cast long shadows, and carved reliefs on fountains reminded everyone of the city's glory. To see all of that without the chatter of commerce must have been disorienting, like stepping into a theatre after the actors have vanished. A quirky tidbit preserved in one Byzantine anecdote claims that a street performer once took advantage of the silence by juggling flaming torches in the empty market, declaring himself Emperor of the Cats. Whether he truly performed for an audience of stray animals or just for his own ego, the detail captures how unsettling absence can be when normal life falls silent. Even absurd acts stand out like proclamations. Imagine it more vividly: a Venetian merchant stepping into the square with bolts of cloth to sell, finding his rivals absent, the stalls unswept, the fountains burbling alone. He might have stood there bewildered, muttering a prayer or cursing his luck. Then picture a mother leading her child by the hand, carrying a wicker basket that stayed empty because there was no bread to buy. The child tugs her sleeve, asking why the bakers had left. She has no answer. The emptiness itself becomes the answer, heavy and inexplicable. And of course silence invites speculation. Was it famine? Byzantine history knows many lean years when grain shipments from the Black Sea faltered. When bread ran out, riots often followed crowds storming the granaries or demanding answers from officials. But if it was famine, why would every merchant vanish at once? Famine usually leaves some desperate sellers behind hawking scraps at inflated prices. Was it plague? Constantinople endured wave after wave of pestilence, from the infamous Justinianic plague to lesser outbreaks that struck unpredictably. Yet plague usually empties houses before markets, not markets before houses. Or was it politics? Perhaps an emperor ordered the square cleared to make a point to remind citizens that imperial power could silence commerce with a single decree. Light joke drifts in here. One could imagine the emperor posting a sign that read, "Closed today for imperial sulking," the medieval equivalent of a passive-aggressive out-of-office email. The Byzantines loved their bureaucracy, but even they might have balked at such a notice. Still, the more one digs, the murkier it becomes. Some scholars suggest the empty market was more metaphor than memory. a way for chroniclers to symbolize collapse, a shorthand image that conveyed the fragility of prosperity. After all medieval writers loved their symbolism, a broken statue meant broken faith, a dried-up fountain meant divine displeasure, and an empty market meant a city on the brink. Historians still argue whether we should take the tale literally or read it as a parable written into the city's memory. Whatever the cause, the idea of an empty Byzantine market haunts the imagination. The empire was famous for its resilience, surviving sieges, invasions, and civil wars that would have sunk lesser states. To picture its mighty capital hollowed out by silence is to glimpse vulnerability beneath the golden mosaics. It is the sort of story that lingers not because it is fully explained, but because it refuses to be. And so the listener drifts with the thought, in a city of 500,000 souls, the heart of trade beats empty for a day, a week, perhaps longer. The fountains gurgle, the cats prowl, the stones remember footsteps that did not come. The empire endures, but for that moment it pauses as if the city itself held its breath. The bazaar rises like a lung in the body of Constantinople, inhaling voices, scents, and footsteps, exhaling clamour into the labyrinth of narrow streets. Stalls stand shoulder to shoulder, their awnings stretched in russet and indigo, flapping slightly in the Bosporus breeze. Merchants arrange amphorae of oil, mounds of figs and bolts of silk dyed teal and saffron, as if preparing for a festival crowd that somehow forgot to show up. The echo of a sandal scraping stone feels louder than it should, and the jingle of a single coin tossed between fingers seems to rattle like thunder. The city is there in architecture, the arches, the colonnades, the marble lion fountains, but strangely absent in life. It is a riddle wrapped in fabric spices and silence. A mainstream fact anchors this imagery. Constantinople was a metropolis of trade where East and West collided. Goods from China, India and the Mediterranean poured through its markets, and its grand bazaar, established formally in the 15th century, became one of the most enduring centres of commerce in the world. The city was no stranger to noise haggling, or the pressure of a crowd. That is why accounts, or rather legends, of a marketplace opening onto emptiness strike so vividly. They twist expectation. Instead of the crush of humanity, the imagined scene delivers only absence. Historians still argue whether this empty market story was metaphor exaggeration or an actual episode of eerie desertion tied to crisis. The mystery rests on the dissonance, a place designed for multitudes found vacant. Picture it: a vendor in russet cloak sets out figs carefully polished with a scrap of linen. He waits for the usual surge of customers, but none come. He rearranges the fruit coughs into the empty air and then shrugs, taking a bite himself. A tailor unfurls a bolt of teal silk so fine it shimmers like water in sunlight. He spreads it across the counter, hoping to lure noble ladies, only to find his only audience is a stray dog that wanders and shakes rainwater from its coat and trots off unimpressed. A goldsmith sets out bangles, bronze and silver and the occasional gilded piece, and his tools clink in the silence as though mocking him. Each gesture, ordinary in itself, becomes uncanny in the absence of response. A quirky tidbit lurks in late medieval and Byzantine anecdote collections. There is mention of a phantom market that opened at dawn with goods neatly laid out, but no sellers in sight, as if ghosts had done the work. Some claimed it was an omen, others a prank by thieves who intended to return later and collect their unattended profits. The story seems unlikely, but it reveals a habit of framing unexplained gaps in the city's rhythm as supernatural. When a pattern of daily life fractured imagination rushed to patch the hole. Absence was not allowed to remain ordinary. Meanwhile, the city itself had rhythms shaped by real pressures. Plague swept through Constantinople more than once, the most devastating being the 6th century outbreak under Justinian. At times, whole quarters were left desolate breadlines, shortened not by abundance, but by death. One could imagine during such moments a marketplace set and ready, but devoid of people, not by miracle, but by tragedy. Yet chroniclers rarely wrote about these gaps directly. They wrote instead about the noise of life returning the celebrations when plague ebbed. The empty market therefore lived more comfortably as legend than as reportage. But legend carries its own truth. Scholars who explore this mystery lean into the symbolism. Was the empty bazaar a parable about imperial decline, a whispered warning that even the greatest markets cannot guarantee security? Or was it simply the product of weary merchants spinning ghost stories to amuse themselves when trade slackened? Historians still argue whether we should treat the tale as allegory or as distorted memory of an actual disruption. Either way, it captures a psychological truth. Markets were the pulse of the city, and any interruption in that pulse felt like death, even if only temporary. Imagine a lone Byzantine guard spear resting against his shoulder, wandering the arcade of shops. He expects to shoo away pickpockets or brawling apprentices, but instead he finds himself yawning into emptiness. He dips a ladle into a water trough, takes a sip, and mutters that he would rather face a riot than this eerie calm. His mutter echoes, and for a moment even he wonders if the stone walls are whispering back. That is the power of silence. It turns skeptics into poets against their will. Another image drifts from folklore: a monk walking through the market at dawn, finding stalls filled with bread still steaming as if freshly baked, yet no bakers present. He pinches a loaf, feels warmth, tastes the crust, and flees in terror, convinced angels or demons had stocked the stalls. The story is strange, improbable, but sticky. Listeners carried it home, embroidered it, and in time the tale blurred into the larger theme of a city sustaining commerce without visible hands. Skeptics roll their eyes, but the point is not whether it happened, it is that people remembered it as possible. Humour, too, never abandoned Constantinople. One anecdote passed among sailors claimed the empty market was staged by clever merchants, testing whether customers would still steal if no one was watching. According to the joke, not a single fig disappeared, which proved the sailors said that Constantinople's thieves were lazier than its traders. Whether the jest was sharp or affectionate is hard to say, but the laughter reminds us that even eerie tales can be repurposed for tavern amusement. Through all of this, the empty market legend sits uneasily between fact and fiction. Too strange to be wholly credible, too resonant to be dismissed outright, it clings to the city's identity. Constantinople, after all, was built on contradictions: Christian and pagan, Roman and Greek, rich and desperate, noisy and eerily still. The empty bazaar, with its merchants present but no customers, or its stalls full but no merchants, mirrors that duality. It says in effect this city is never entirely what it seems, and so the narrative presses forward, weaving the market into the larger riddle of empire. Goods weight coins gleam, torches sputter, but footsteps are missing. Is it omen, accident, or invention? The chroniclers leave us guessing, and perhaps that is the point. To walk through the empty bazaar of Constantinople is not to find answers, but to feel questions pressing in, as insistent as the shadows under its vaulted roof. The empty marketplace sits silent, but the city beyond its stone gates stirs with faint echoes of its past. The Byzantines had called Constantinople the queen of cities, a jewel, where domes caught sunlight and mosaics glittered like frozen starlight. In its heyday, the market itself overflowed with colour merchants hawking silks from the east, fishmongers waving baskets at customers, and spice sellers dusting the air with saffron, cinnamon and pepper. Tonight, though, the listener imagines all that bustle drained away. The stalls remain their awnings sagging like tired eyelids, but the voices are gone, the eerie part. Even in the silence one can almost hear echoes, as though the stone remembers every shout and bargain struck. That's the unsettling charm of ghostly marketplaces, they feel louder when empty. A mainstream fact sets the stage here. Constantinople was not merely a city, but the commercial hub linking Asia and Europe, with its markets forming the arteries that carried wealth across empires. Grain from Egypt, furs from the north, gems from India, all of it once passed through these cobbled squares. To stand here and see nothing, not even a stray dog sniffing for scraps, is to confront absence so sharp it feels like presence in reverse. Imagine a modern mall with lights blazing but not a single shopper in sight. Creepy, absolutely. Profitable, not at all. The storytellers of later centuries couldn't resist adding quirky flourishes. One tale suggests that when the market opened to emptiness, a lone goose strutted through the stalls as if it had declared itself emperor. Another whispers of merchants who arrived early, set out their wares, and then stared at each other in awkward silence when no customers appeared, each too proud to pack up first. Was this reality satire or just some medieval prankster's version of gossip? Hard to say. But quirky tidbits like these cling to ruins like ivy, ensuring that even solemn silence isn't safe from a touch of humour. Historians still argue whether this strange emptiness ever happened as described. Was it a single morning when a storm kept everyone home, later exaggerated into legend? Or was it tied to one of the city's sieges when hunger and fear turned markets into graveyards? Some suggest a symbolic layer, the empty stalls, as a metaphor scribbled by a chronicler for the decline of empire, a neat piece of literary theatre disguised as eyewitness testimony. After all, medieval writers were less concerned with strict fact-checking and more with telling a story that carried weight. If exaggeration made a point, then exaggeration was welcomed like a guest at supper. Yet the image persists, a market square paved in marble, its fountains dry its colonnades, echoing with footsteps of no one at all. Sunlight falls slantwise through a tangle of clouds, gilding dust motes that drift in lazy spirals. An abandoned stall still carries the faint scent of dried figs, a smell that clings long after fruit has vanished. Somewhere a shutter creaks as the wind nudges it, as if the city itself is trying to speak but keeps forgetting the words. There's a peculiar dignity in such stillness, as though the market refuses to complain about being deserted. One can imagine travellers arriving by ship, stepping eagerly off the docks, only to find that the famed bazaar of Constantinople looks more like an abandoned stage after a play has ended. Their disappointment must have been palpable, the kind of awkward silence that makes people shuffle their feet and mumble excuses. And yet in that disappointment, the seed of legend grows. An empty marketplace in the greatest city of Christendom. That's the kind of mystery that makes people lean in closer when the tale is retold over wine and firelight. Practical theories keep cropping up. Some argue the emptiness was tied to disease. The city suffered through outbreaks of plague more than once, and markets often bore the brunt of restrictions. Imagine health officials, not the clipboard-wielding types of today, but stern men with wax tablets ordering the square shut. The merchants, unwilling but compliant, stay away. The next morning, perhaps a visitor stumbles into the square expecting noise, and trade only to find silence and shuttered stalls. In the retelling, the detail of disease fades, but the eerie emptiness remains polished into legend. Or perhaps it was politics. The Byzantine Empire was riddled with intrigues sharper than daggers, and sudden decrees often left citizens confused. One emperor might have ordered merchants to relocate to a different square, while another demanded new taxes that kept them at home in protest. Bureaucratic chaos could empty a market faster than plague or storm. After all, nothing chills commerce like the rumour of a new tax collector sniffing around the ledger books. And still, through all these guesses, the haunting imagery endures: empty stalls beneath colonnades, a wind carrying the smell of sea salt through deserted alleys, and the sense that history itself hit pause for a moment. The fact that historians still debate the cause adds to the allure. Mystery thrives not on answers but on the gaps between them. A joke bubbles up here because even ghost stories can't resist one. Imagine two Byzantine officials walking through the empty marketplace. One says, "Well, at least no one is breaking the rules." The other replies, "Yes, but no one is paying taxes either." Silence can be spooky, but silence without revenue. That's the stuff of true nightmares for empires. The section closes with the market itself imagined in twilight. Shadows lengthen between columns, and the last rays of sun catch on mosaics that still gleam faintly even without human eyes to admire them. The listener can almost hear the sigh of stone, weary of holding so many unanswered questions. A city that once measured time in bells' prayers and coin clinks finds itself wrapped in stillness, and the story drifts onward, carrying its unanswered mystery like a torch that burns low but refuses to go out. The streets once lined with merchants shouting prices for spices and silks now echo only with the flap of pigeons' wings and the shuffle of the occasional stray dog. The marketplace of Constantinople should have been alive with commerce, yet the city seems emptied overnight like a stage set where the actors have forgotten their lines. Stalls stand intact, awnings droop in saffron, an indigo cloth amphorae of wine remain uncorked on wooden carts, but no hands reach to bargain, no voices argue over coin. It is as if a single breath had been drawn by the city and then held forever. A faint smell of brine drifts from the nearby Golden Horn, mixing with the sweet rot of figs abandoned in wicker baskets. Even the gulls circling overhead seem hesitant, their cries bouncing hollowly against the stone arcades. The strangest detail is the preparation the market looks ready for business. Coins lie on counters as though dropped mid-purchase wax tablets of accounts, rest beside ledgers still open, and clay lamps glow faintly as if someone tended them only hours before. This eerie readiness suggests not decay over years, but an interruption an audience called away mid-performance. Historians still argue whether the abandonment was sudden, perhaps sparked by rumour of plague or threat of invasion, or whether the emptiness is an illusion created by later storytellers who embroidered silence into spectacle. Yet the image endures a metropolis prepared for exchange and laughter, but filled only with absence. A mainstream historical fact threads through this quiet picture. Constantinople was one of the busiest trade hubs of the medieval world. From the 10th to the 12th centuries especially, it pulsed with Venetian, Genoese, Arab and Armenian traders. The Messiet's main thoroughfare would have been a roaring artery of languages and wares, the closest thing the medieval world had to Times Square blended with Wall Street. To imagine such a place empty is to imagine the heartbeat of empire stopped mid-pulse. And yet stories persisted of mornings when stalls stood without sellers, a riddle that unnerved even those who trusted little in rumour. One quirky tidbit drifts in from a Venetian merchant's account. He claimed that on a visit he found every market stall abandoned, yet every ledger marked with the same symbol, a crude fish drawn in charcoal. Whether it was graffiti code or idle prank is uncertain, but he joked that perhaps the city had gone to lunch all at once, leaving only the fish to bargain on their behalf. His fellow sailors laughed, yet such strange anecdotes stuck, feeding later imaginations, with just enough absurdity to lend the emptiness texture. After all, what is more memorable, a silent market, or one in which a doodle of a fish presides over commerce? As the story of the deserted market spread, philosophers picked it up as metaphor. Some claimed it represented the fragility of empire riches, and splendour vanish overnight, leaving behind only mute testimony of human busyness. Others painted it as a parable about pride, Constantinople, jewel of the world, reminded by fate that even she could stand speechless. Preachers leaned on the tale during sermons, warning congregations that markets of greed might be silenced by divine rebuke. Historians still argue whether the emptiness was ever real, but they agree that the symbolism became real enough in the minds of those who retold it. Consider the sensory strangeness of it. Imagine walking through marble colonnades with every stall open, but no voices greeting you. Picture fruit spoiling in baskets, flies buzzing lazily, fountains still pouring cool water though no child splashes nearby. The listener may picture their own local market stripped of bustle and left to the wind, and the uncanny eeriness sharpens. 3 jokes slip into this silence too, because history, like markets, needs levity. First, one wit claimed the vendors had all left together to haggle with angels over heavenly tax rates. Second, another quipped that the silence was simply Constantinople's way of taking a coffee break, centuries before espresso was invented. Third, a playful traveller swore that cats had negotiated with the gods to have the city to themselves, which anyone familiar with Byzantine cats might agree sounds less like legend and more like inevitability. And yet beneath laughter unease grows. If a city's busiest heart can fall silent, what does that say about the endurance of empire? Did the citizens retreat indoors at rumour of plague? Did soldiers march them away to defend the walls? Or did some collective superstition grip them into absence? Archaeologists have found no mass graves timed neatly to the tale, no decree ordering sudden evacuation. This lack of evidence is both frustrating and alluring. It leaves the stage clear for speculation, and speculation is fertile soil for mystery. The deserted market becomes not only an anecdote, but a mirror in which every generation glimpses its own fears. Disease, war, divine punishment, or simple accident magnified into omen. Imagine too the foreigner arriving by ship. He expects bustle, bargaining, the loud embrace of commerce. Instead, he climbs the marble steps and finds only gulls and the slap of sails against masts in the harbour. He may call out, hear his voice bounce along arcades, and feel smaller for it. In that instant, the mighty empire shrinks to a hollow shell. The silence itself becomes the loudest proclamation that even the richest city might stand empty, that life might vanish, leaving only props in place. And as he turns to leave, the fire of rumour already burns brighter than any lamp he might carry. The story rolls forward, preserved in chronicles, whispered in taverns, painted in imagination. Whether true or embroidered, it is now part of the city's legend. A market fully set for trade yet utterly devoid of people becomes a timeless tableau of absence. The pigeons still strut, the cats still lounge, the gulls still wheel, but the humans are missing, and their absence rattles louder than any crowd. The fire's grip on imagination has shifted again this time into the domain of whispers and folklore that spread not only in Chios, but across the Byzantine world. Once the shock of the empty market scene fades, chroniclers lean into the mystery. How could a city so carefully built, its marketplaces so well stocked, be found deserted yet still carry the faint smell of bread as if someone had just walked away, the tale retold over wine and copied into marginal notes of manuscripts, places the market square in the same category as the Eternal Fire, an ordinary place that insists on being extraordinary. And here the story acquires its next layer of intrigue, the marketplace of Constantinople, that supposedly opened one dawn with all stalls ready, food displayed lamps lit, yet no buyers or sellers to be seen. Mainstream fact slides easily into this setting. Byzantine Constantinople really was famed for its bustling markets called fora, such as the Forum of Constantine or the Forum of Theodosius, each crowded with spice merchants, silk dealers, bakers and farmers hawking their produce. To imagine such a hub empty feels almost like a joke about New York's Times Square shutting down at midday without explanation. That contrast alone fuels the unease. If a fire that never died bent the rules of nature, then a market emptied overnight bent the rules of society. The quirky tidbit here comes from a much later retelling. One source claims that cats, dogs and even birds avoided the market that morning. In fact, one monk scribbled that even pigeons refused to land on the deserted stalls, circling instead in confused spirals above the square. Was this embellishment? Almost certainly. But it paints a picture that sticks an absence so profound it unsettled not only humans but animals too. In a city where dogs usually squabbled over scraps and cats prowled under every table, their absence becomes louder than any crowd. Historians still argue whether the empty market story has any factual basis at all. Some suggest it echoes times of plague when sudden quarantines cleared neighbourhoods, leaving only goods behind. Others imagine it as an allegory invented by preachers who wanted to warn listeners about greed painting a parable of abundance without buyers, wealth without use. Still others propose a more political reading, perhaps a sudden tax raid, or imperial decree frightened merchants into hiding. The truth remains slippery, but the legend lingers because it captures the uncanny, the wrongness of silence in a place built for noise. As the narration drifts through this eerie morning, the scene sharpens marble colonnades shining faintly with dew, baskets of figs still moist from washing amphorae of oil, left open bread loaves cooling in neat rows. The lamps are still burning their oil not yet spent as though lit moments before, and yet the footsteps that should echo on stone are missing. If you listen closely in imagination, you almost hear your own steps in the void louder than they should be. Jokes were even whispered that perhaps the merchants had simply decided to unionize overnight, staging the world's first surprise strike. Imagine a medieval shopkeeper saying, "Fine, if you won't raise the bread price, I'm taking the day off." Humour cushions dread, but the unease remains. This market legend also bridges back to the eternal fire of Chios. Just as the flame refused to behave like ordinary flame, this market refused to behave like ordinary society. Both stories carry the same core discomfort. When the expected rhythms of life break, people rush to fill the gap with meaning. Was the market emptied as a divine warning? Did angels or demons sweep the stalls clean of their owners? Did time itself pause, leaving goods in place but whisking people elsewhere? Each theory adds a layer of drama. The story, of course, spreads beyond Chios and Constantinople. Sailors claim they heard of the deserted market in distant ports, retelling it as if they themselves had walked the empty stalls. In one tavern tale, a drunken sailor insisted he bought a loaf of bread that morning only to find it crumbled into dust the moment he took a bite. Whether this was a metaphor for bad baking or a half-remembered story blurred by ale, it became one of those details too strange to forget. In the soft ASMR cadence of memory, the scene continues, stray gusts of wind lifting saffron-coloured cloths from the counters, sending them fluttering like ghost flags. Shadows moving across carved stone lions that guard the market gates. A single olive rolling across the paving stones, clicking faintly in the silence. One can almost see children daring each other to step inside, only to shriek and run out when their own echoes spooked them. Byzantine officials, practical as ever, were said to have recorded the incident dryly if they recorded it at all. A note in one account mentions a market delay on a certain feast day, but gives no reason. Bureaucrats rarely indulge in drama. They prefer to blame poor accounting. Yet in the silence of what they did not write, legends mushroomed. A bureaucrat's shrug became for later storytellers proof of something uncanny. The marketplace, therefore, becomes part of the wider tapestry of unsolved mysteries in Byzantine history. Just as Greek fire baffled enemies, and just as the fire of Chios unsettled travellers, so too did this empty market, lodge itself into the popular imagination. Its strangeness lives not in material proof, but in how it continues to be retold. You can almost picture some weary scribe hunched at his desk, muttering as he copied the story. If the market was empty, why am I still writing about it, before sneezing in the lamp smoke and continuing anyway? In the end, whether plague parable or prank, the tale remains a quiet metaphor for absence. Markets are meant to be full. Their emptiness strikes harder than any battle. Perhaps that is why the story refuses to fade. It captures the fear that one morning without warning the familiar may simply fail to appear. By dawn the next day, the market's awnings bloom again like small sails, and the city officials sleep creased, ink smudged, and pretending they are not worried, move through the stalls with wax tablets ready recording who shows up, who vanishes, and who swears they saw a crowd that turned out to be mist. The eparch's clerks, trained to keep Constantinople running on time, tally bread, salt, fish, olives, pepper, mastic, onions, and those currant cakes that always sell first, then look up from neat columns of numbers into streets that echo too clearly, because numbers have music when a city is healthy, and today the rhythm keeps dropping beats. The great spine of the Mese stone shadow and colonnade waits for feet that do not come, so the fishmongers talk to their eels. The cheesemonger cuts precise moons he cannot sell, and an apprentice goldsmith taps a test rod against a ring just for the comfort of hearing metal answer. A mainstream fact lends weight to the scene. In the 10th century, the Book of the Eparch really does regulate these guilds, naming bakers, butchers and fishmongers, fixing weights, prices, and the hour bread must be ready. So their morning routine is half devotion, half choreography. And when the audience vanishes, the steps feel foolish, like practicing a bow before an empty throne. A runner arrives from the harbour, breath frosting in the shade, despite the season reporting that the Neorian quays are quiet. No bales broken, no stevedores whistling, only gulls disputing scraps, and a lone dog sleeping where a cargo net should lie. The eparch frowns and sends 2 more men with tablets to the granaries near the Strategion, because grain is politics you can eat, and if sacks are still sealed, then the emergency is mood, not supply. Light joke 1. The junior clerk suggests maybe the city took a collective day off, then instantly volunteers to check the hippodrome just in case the blues and greens scheduled a surprise parade. Up the hill, Hagia Sophia breathes incense. A deacon pads across cool marble and whispers that the nave sounded different at matins. Prayers, smaller echo, larger, and a candle lighter. Nods explaining with the certainty of a man who owns exactly 2 facts that the wax pulled faster today, surely an omen. The sacristan with the keys does not argue because superstition is cheaper than new candles. Still, when a priest steps outside, he sees the market square with its tables of pomegranates, garlanded fish and matched amphorae of oil laid out like promises, and no one reaches for any of it, which makes even practical men think about angels who fail to wander by. Meanwhile, the imperial chancery tries to behave like a well-oiled hinge, sending purple-sealed notes to the city wards. Assemble, reassure, resume. Couriers pound the stones of the Augusteon, their sandals slapping, and a captain of the watch collects men with spears and a comic assortment of confiscated sticks, telling them to stroll to be seen to look like certainty on 2 legs. Quirky tidbit. The watch, short on lanterns, sometimes hires boys to clack wooden clappers at alleys, to announce patrols sound as prophylactic, and today, the clappers echo bravely against silence that needs no convincing. Scholars will later say the emptiness cannot be measured, only mapped by reactions, so the notaries of the Hagios Theodoros district draft identical phrasing for 100 contracts to be perfected upon the return of the public, proving bureaucracy can postpone reality with a flourish. The midwives of the Chalcopratia agree to sit closer to their doors for any woman in labour who finds the streets unkind because life keeps its own schedule. Historians still argue whether some forgotten proclamation, fear of plague, rumour of tax raid, whisper of portents triggered a one-morning retreat, a shy strike by the populace, or whether chroniclers stitched several thin incidents into one luxurious absence. But on the ground, the day feels like a table set for guests who will not knock. The bakers bound by law to keep the ovens going lest the city riot shovel dough into the heat, then barter with the ravens when loaves cool unclaimed. A flour-dusted master slices around and passes it to the eparch's man with half a shrug, half a prayer. The shrug says, "Eat the prayer," says, "Come back." Mainstream fact again steadies us. Constantinople's bread dole sometimes depends on numbers calculated to the ounce, and any hiccup in distribution rattles nerves faster than drums at the Golden Gate. Light joke 2 sneaks in with the steam. One baker mutters that if the whole city is hiding, he'll just eat everyone's lunch and finally achieve the physique of a triumphant wrestler, which draws a tired laugh the day's first. Down by the Forum of Constantine, a perfume seller lifts lids from tiny glass vials to perfume the air on principle, because scent persuades, even when reason stumbles and she tells a Syrian spiceman that she'll bottle absinthe if the silence keeps paying visits. He replies that he already sells it. It is the gap between supply and demand, and they both grin commerce reinventing itself as comedy. Nearby, a physician of the Hippocratic school stands on a step and recommends warm wine and patience as 2 universal prescriptions, while his assistant holds a basket of leeches that wriggle like punctuation marks waiting for an argument. In a courtyard off the Mese, an old scribe straightens a sheet of parchment and drafts a report to the logothete of the drome, describing an observable diminution of traffic without visible cause, then ruins the bureaucratic dignity of the sentence by adding a marginal note. The pigeons, however, are present and accounted for because the city's birds, bless them, perform density better than any census. A novice monk collecting alms pauses near the fruit tables and arranges quints in the shape of a cross, just a gesture just in case, and a child darting from a doorway rearranges them into a fish. Just to be funny, then vanishes again into the hush as if silence were a game of hide-and-seek and he is winning. By midday, the sun warms the bronze of the column of Justinian. The horse atop gleams as if saluting an invisible parade, and the market guild elders, realizing the day will not mend itself, hold a quick council under an awning stitched in indigo. They agree to halve prices after none, to send criers through the lanes, and to donate unsold bread to the Xenodokia, the city hostels, before sunset. One elder suggests staging a small, cheerful brawl. Nothing draws a crowd like noise, but his wife seated behind him with her sewing says the city does not need theatrics when it already has anxiety, and he yields with a grin because experience teaches that a whispered truth beats a shouted tactic. Afternoon leans long, the criers circle their voices courteous and a little embarrassed. Good people, your market waits, and somewhere behind a shutter, a woman laughs, not unkindly because summonses do not fix moods. Still a few figures appear slow as cats testing rain. A widow choosing saltfish carefully, a soldier buying dates. He swears he does not like 2 students arguing prosody while fingering pears. Coins clink at last modest as the first birds at dawn, and the officials pretend they expected this exact tempo for authority. Depends on looking unsurprised. Light joke 3 waves from the edge. The junior clerk records the first purchase of the day with such flourish that he breaks his stylus, then declares it a sacrifice to prosperous accounting. The books, now kissed by numbers, begin to look less like funerals and more like recipes. When evening comes, the guild elders bless the unsold with the practical piety of a city that survives by sharing. Bread goes out with baskets toward hostels, fish to the kitchens of a monastery where novices peel garlic and pretend not to cry oil, to lamps that will pool gold across stone. The epoch's men close their tablets, the watch folds clappers into belts, and a breeze at last tugs scents together, anise brine smoke like threads rewoven after a snag. Tomorrow may answer nothing. The scholars will still quarrel, the chronicles may compress this day into a sly line, but the market built for resilience keeps laying out its table each morning, confident that cities breathe, and that sometimes a breath is simply held then released. The silence that follows the vanished crowd lingers like a bad dream. Constantinople, once bursting with the shuffle of sandals and the buzz of merchants, sits in uncanny stillness. Streets that were designed to funnel thousands now carry only the echo of footsteps. A stray dog noses through an overturned basket, the scent of figs and olives still clinging to it, but no hand reaches to chase it away. Even the pigeons that normally mob the plaza seem half-hearted, their coos swallowed by the emptiness of the city's heart. The market, meant to be a theatre of human drama, has instead become a stage with no actors, only props left behind in disarray. The stillness presses so heavily that one could almost believe the stones themselves have chosen silence as a form of protest. In this surreal hush, the few who dare walk the colonnades glance over their shoulders constantly, as though expecting the walls to whisper or the ground to tremble. A woman in a russet cloak pulls her shawl tight and mutters that the city must have angered the saints. Beside her, a barefoot boy scuffs his heel against the marble, pretending he isn't frightened, though his eyes keep darting toward the archways. Mainstream fact here, Constantinople's markets in their heyday drew not only locals, but also merchants from Armenia, Egypt, and even distant Rus, making it a true hub of international exchange. To see them now, so thoroughly abandoned, would have shocked even the most skeptical observer. The contrast is not just eerie, it is a punchline without a joke, a play without an audience, and the city itself feels complicit in the performance. One of the stranger reports from this period claims that a man set up his stall anyway, arranging amphorae of wine loaves of bread and small jars of honey, insisting loudly that trade must go on. With no customers, he sold nothing but kept up a running commentary as though hawking to ghosts. Some later chroniclers mock him as a fool, while others paint him as heroic, a stubborn merchant who refused to let emptiness dictate reality. This is the quirky tidbit that slips into the record, a man shouting prices into the void, convincing himself that the echoes were bargains being struck. Historians still argue whether such accounts are literal truth, or metaphorical shorthand meant to emphasize the extent of the market's desolation. But even if exaggerated, the detail endures because it captures the human impulse to deny despair by acting normal, even when nothing around you is normal. The eerie absence also provokes theories that border on the absurd. One camp insists that disease swept through the city, killing so suddenly that bodies could not even be buried before families fled. Another whispers about divine punishment, God smiting the pride of Byzantium with a taste of what Sodom once endured. A third, less pious explanation suggests that political upheaval scared people indoors, leaving streets clear out of fear rather than death. Each theory has holes large enough to march a parade through. If disease struck, why are there no piles of corpses recorded? If divine wrath descended, why does no surviving text thunder against a particular sin? If politics drove fear, why are there no decrees or chronicles marking the moment? The debate continues restless as the Bosporus tide, because the absence of evidence has only sharpened the mystery rather than dimming it. Walking through these silent markets in imagination, one can almost hear the hollow clatter of dropped coins rolling across marble untouched. The awnings of stalls flap lazily in the wind, bright dyes of indigo and saffron fading under an unappreciated sun. A pile of clay lamps gathers dust, unsold their wicks, waiting for flames that never come. Cats, ever the opportunists, stretch themselves over counters where salted fish once drew buyers, by the dozen their indifference a parody of commerce. The sheer ordinariness of the objects contrasts brutally with the extraordinary absence of people. It feels like stumbling onto a stage between acts, except the audience has also left, and the actors never plan to return. The image unsettles because it collapses the familiar into the uncanny. A market should be noisy, irritating, crowded with bargains and boasting. Here all of that collapses into one vast absence, and in that vacuum human imagination fills the space with what it cannot see. Some swear they heard footsteps even when no one walked. Others describe phantom voices echoing bargains as though the ghosts of buyers returned out of habit. Skeptics laugh and suggest these were only echoes bouncing off domes and colonnades. But such rational explanations never quite erase the prickling on the back of the neck when confronted with too much silence. The truth, if there was one, has long slipped between the cracks of parchment and memory. The humour of the situation, though dark, occasionally sneaks in. Later storytellers describe the empty stalls as being perfectly suited for children to play mock merchants, loudly declaring prices of imaginary goods to invisible buyers. Another tale claims that one clever fellow rented several empty spaces at a discount, declaring himself the most successful businessman in Constantinople, because he held the majority of the market without competition. He had, of course, no customers, but insisted his monopoly was proof of divine favour. Jokes like these preserve not only the unease, but also the coping mechanism of laughter, reminding us that even in strange desolation, people found ways to poke fun at their own bewilderment. Through it all, the empty market becomes less a physical place than a metaphor. It is a reflection of fragility, the reminder that a city so carefully built, so proudly declared eternal, could be rendered voiceless in an instant. This paradox gnaws at chroniclers and modern historians alike. Was the silence real? Was it exaggerated? Or was it simply an allegory crafted by writers who wanted to shock their readers into moral reflection? Historians still argue whether the account should be read literally or symbolically, but either way, the image of an abandoned Constantinople market refuses to leave the stage of imagination. And so, in this section of the tale, we are left standing in the marble plaza, with the empty stalls and the whispering wind listening for voices that never come. The fire of commerce has guttered out, replaced by the chill of absence. And in that absence, we sense both the vulnerability of empires and the enduring power of unanswered questions. The market's silence continues to speak louder than any sail that was ever struck there, and perhaps that is why the story endures, because sometimes nothing is the loudest sound of all. The streets of Constantinople sometimes feel like a stage where one actor has forgotten to show up. People wander into the marketplace ready for the familiar din of barter and chatter, but what they find is space echoing uncanny and unsettling in its emptiness. Imagine a colonnaded forum designed to hold thousands, now filled with the shuffle of only a handful of merchants adjusting their wares. The sound of a cart creaking over cobblestones is louder than the clamour of a dozen stalls. Silence becomes the loudest commodity. It is not simply the absence of people that stings, but the sense that an entire way of life is holding its breath, waiting for someone to exhale. And yet markets always adapt. A fruit seller arranges figs with exaggerated precision, as though hoping neat rows might coax customers into appearing. A spice dealer wafts cinnamon in the air not because buyers are near, but because he believes the aroma might attract them like bees to a flower. The emptiness itself becomes a marketing strategy. Quirky tales are born from this improvisation. One chronicler claims a merchant began hiring boys to run through the forum and shout prices loudly, so the city at least sounded busy even when the stalls were nearly deserted. Whether true or embellished, it reveals the desperation of traders to preserve the illusion of bustle. A mainstream historical fact grounds this scene. The Byzantine economy in its later centuries relied heavily on long-distance trade grain from Egypt, silk from Asia, spices from the East, and furs from Russia. When those arteries of commerce were severed by war, piracy, or shifting alliances, markets in Constantinople starved for goods. An empty marketplace was not just eerie, it was symptomatic of systemic decline. Historians still argue whether these silences were momentary interruptions caused by crises or signs of deeper decay woven into the empire's fabric. Was the market quiet only after sieges, or was it increasingly a permanent feature of late Byzantine life? Still, there is a strange resilience in absence. The emptiness becomes ritual. Citizens stroll through the arcades not to buy, but to remember. A nobleman pauses before a shuttered shop where his father once purchased silks. A widow sits at a fountain recalling the days when the splash of water was drowned out by gossip. These quiet pilgrimages turn commerce into memory. People begin to treat the marketplace not only as an economic engine, but as a theatre of nostalgia. The absence of trade itself becomes a story retold across dinner tables. Do you remember when the market stood empty for weeks? Memory fills the void where money once clinked. Religion, as always, provides another layer of meaning. Priests sermonize about the empty marketplace as divine punishment, proof that greed had driven people to ruin. Some compare it to Christ driving the moneylenders from the temple, suggesting that silence is itself a sacred cleansing. Pilgrims visiting the city often wander through the ghostly stalls and carry away stories of a metropolis that seem to trade in mysteries rather than goods. One scribe even describes the abandoned market as a cloister, without monks turning commerce into monastic meditation. Whether this was irony or reverence is left unsaid, and yet humour lingers even in hollow spaces. A playful tale claims that one baker, finding no customers, began selling loaves to pigeons. He tossed crumbs onto the stone floor and announced loudly that business was thriving. Other merchants joked that the pigeons haggled better than nobles demanding extra seeds as a discount. It may be a fabrication, but it reflects the human instinct to mock even the most unsettling situations. When silence presses too heavily, a joke about bread-loving pigeons lightens the mood. Architecture plays its role in amplifying absence. Constantinople's markets were not modest squares. They were sprawling complexes framed by columns, arches and domes. An empty one is not merely blank, it echoes like a cathedral. Imagine walking under marble arcades where the sound of your footsteps bounces off stone magnified until you feel like the last person alive. Light slants through broken roof tiles, illuminating dust motes instead of silk banners. What was designed for spectacle now stages a performance of vacancy. Even the pigeons seem aware of the drama, fluttering in slow circles like actors rehearsing a scene without lines. The politics of empire also creep into this silence. When emperors needed to display stability, they staged processions through the markets even if the stalls were bare. Officials paraded soldiers, priests and banners to fill the void with ceremony. One document describes how during a famine the emperor distributed bread in the empty forum, transforming absence into a backdrop for imperial charity. It was theatre pure and simple. A silent market could be embarrassing, but with the right choreography it became a stage for political performance. The people may have been hungry, but at least they were given a show. Historians still argue whether these staged events were effective or laughable. Did citizens truly feel reassured when emperors walked through empty arcades surrounded by pomp, or did they mutter in taverns that parades could not replace grain? The debate lingers because sources disagree. Some accounts speak of awe, others of cynicism. The truth likely swayed with the wind of each crisis. Yet even cynicism keeps the story alive, for a joke muttered over wine has as much historical weight as a proclamation etched in stone. As night falls, the empty market shifts once more. Torches cast long shadows across shuttered stalls. Cats slink between overturned baskets, their eyes gleaming in the flicker. A lone musician plays a reed pipe in the colonnade, his tune echoing across stone as though filling in for absent buyers. Listeners gather not to purchase, but to linger. In this way, the marketplace reinvents itself not as a hub of trade, but as a theatre of memory, faith, politics, and music. It proves that emptiness is not always void. Sometimes it is the beginning of a different kind of fullness, and so the marketplace, even in silence, remains central to Constantinople's story. What was once a stage for commerce becomes a stage for imagination. It carries the whispers of pigeons, the songs of pipe players, the sermons of priests, and the footsteps of wanderers. The emptiness is not an end, but a transformation, a paradox that invites endless retelling. After all, how can a place built for noise sound so eloquent in silence? The conversation around the empty markets of Constantinople refuses to die even centuries after the stalls themselves fell silent. What fascinates is not only the absence of buyers, but also the abundance of interpreters who keep trying to explain that absence. Step into the grand libraries of Europe and later the humming lecture halls of modern universities, and you find that the flame of debate burns almost as stubbornly as the eternal fire of chaos. Historians, archaeologists, economists, and the occasional novelist all take their turns trying to conjure up the scene of merchants unpacking wares before a ghostly crowd. And as always, the more people talk, the more the story twists, bends, and grows teeth of its own. The irony is delicious. A marketplace where no one showed up has turned into a marketplace of endless theories. One mainstream fact serves as a constant anchor. Constantinople was not just any city, but the beating heart of the Byzantine world. At its height, it was home to perhaps 500,000 people, with markets so vital that their rhythms determined not just daily diets, but the stability of emperors. Bread riots, as we've already brushed against in earlier moments of this tale, were capable of toppling rulers and forcing reforms. To imagine those markets eerily empty is therefore not to imagine a mild inconvenience, but rather a potential crisis, as dangerous as an enemy army. That detail grounds the story in the hard reality of Byzantine life. When the markets wavered, so too did thrones. Still, scholars circle back to the problem of sources. Was there really a day when the stalls were left unsold, or is the account a later invention designed to dramatize some other shortage? Some argue that the image of an empty market could have been symbolic, a literary flourish used to condemn imperial mismanagement. Others suggest it reflects a genuine moment of disaster, perhaps linked to plague, famine, or even a siege. Historians still argue whether the silence in the marketplace was literal silence or rhetorical thunder. Either way, the debate shows how historians themselves sometimes shop for meaning, the way citizens once shopped for bread, comparing stalls, weighing goods, and leaving with armfuls of speculation. Quirky tidbits pop up even in these academic wrangles. A 19th century antiquarian once claimed to have found graffiti on a Constantinople wall that read, "What good are spices if no one eats?" The authenticity of the scroll is highly questionable. It may have been a cheeky invention by the antiquarian himself, but the phrase has lingered in secondary accounts as though carved into stone. Another curious anecdote has a monk in later chronicles musing that the market emptied because angels carried away the faithful in a rapture, leaving only vendors scratching their heads. It is almost certainly allegory, yet the image of bewildered merchants staring at baskets of figs while heaven lifts away their customers is so vivid that even sober historians occasionally smirk when citing it. Sometimes the strangest embroidery sticks the hardest. The debate, though, often dry on the page, takes on a theatrical quality when scholars gather in person. Imagine a dimly lit seminar room, dust motes floating like incense, while one professor thunders that the empty markets prove evidence of famine. Across the table, another insists that no famine records match the date, and therefore the story is metaphorical. A third interjects with a comparison to Rome's own bread supply, noting that satirists there also love to exaggerate shortages. The argument rolls on, and somewhere in the corner a weary graduate student doodles Byzantine coins while wondering why mysteries always come with footnotes longer than the actual story. Light joke 1. If markets had sold academic theories, they would never have been empty. Plenty of buyers, no shortage of supply. Meanwhile, modern archaeologists attempt to bring spades and soil samples into the fray. Excavations in the city sometimes reveal storage jars with traces of grain fish bones, discarded in heaps, or amphorae once carrying wine from the Aegean. These finds tell us that commerce thrived for centuries, yet they cannot pinpoint a day or even a season of emptiness. Material culture is stubbornly silent when it comes to fleeting events. You can find where the bread was baked, but not necessarily whether it sold out or sat ignored. The archaeologist's dilemma is like trying to reconstruct yesterday's grocery list from crumbs in the trash. Light joke 2. If ancient shoppers had only left Yelp reviews, half of this debate would have been solved. Literary scholars, for their part, love to trace how the story travelled across languages. A single phrase in Greek describing an empty agora could be translated as deserted quiet, or abandoned, each carrying its own nuance. Did the scribe mean literally no people, or merely fewer than usual copyists, as they moved the tale into Latin, or later tongues, sometimes exaggerated for dramatic effect? The result is a telephone game stretching across centuries in which a modest complaint about poor turnout might swell into a dramatic image of ghostly stalls. Historians still argue whether mistranslations inflated the event into legend, but the possibility alone keeps the marketplace buzzing in scholarly chatter. Beyond the libraries and trenches, popular imagination still takes hold of the story. Travel writers in the early 20th century described wandering through the ruins of Constantinople's forums and imagining the day the city forgot to shop. Novelists picked up the threads spinning tales of sorcery conspiracies and invisible plagues that emptied the capital overnight. Even television documentaries occasionally drop in an image of deserted Byzantine markets to add spice to their tales of decline. None of these versions are strictly true, but they show how the empty stalls live on less as history and more as storytelling fuel. A single enigmatic line from a chronicler has blossomed into an entire genre of speculation. And then there are the jokes that refuse to stay buried. A popular quip among Byzantinists goes, "The markets of Constantinople were empty once when all the historians went there at the same time." It's a bit of insider humour, but it captures the truth that academic fascination can itself distort the thing it studies. If too many eyes stare at one mystery, it sometimes vanishes into smoke. Light joke 3, maybe the empty stalls weren't a sign of famine, but just that everyone was stuck in traffic outside the Theodosian walls. Through all of this, the empty marketplace remains a paradox. Its power lies less in proving what happened, and more in reminding us how people react when certainty slips away. Some demand data, others weave metaphors, still others chuckle at the absurdity of it all. The absence itself becomes a presence filling books, conferences, and imaginations. The fire of curiosity continues to burn long after the actual fires of Constantinople's ovens went cold. And so Section 9 drifts onward, a chorus of scholarly voices echoing through the centuries, never quite harmonizing, but never quite falling silent either. The story does not rush to its conclusion. Instead, it lingers the way twilight does, a slow unwinding of colour and sound before darkness sets in. Constantinople's market, once so alive with rumour wealth, and the strangeness of its emptiness, becomes less a place on a map, and more a parable whispered across generations. The city around it may have faltered, crowds may have thinned, emperors may have died in their chambers with more creditors than mourners. Yet the tale of an open market with no citizens persists like an echo refusing to fade. It is not stone or bronze that grants longevity here, but curiosity. The sort of curiosity that keeps listeners awake a little longer than they meant to, leaning toward the flame of a story that refuses to burn out. Mainstream fact steadies the final frame. Constantinople did indeed endure for centuries as the capital of Byzantium, its markets sometimes bustling, sometimes near empty, depending on famine, siege, or plague. Grain ships from Egypt once fed its population, and later Venetian and Genoese merchants jostled for dominance in its harbours. That survival itself is astonishing because few cities have ever withstood so many sieges, so many changes in fortune, and still remained recognisable as the Queen of the Bosporus. Yet within those long centuries gaps appear, moments when the city seemed hollow, when the crowds that usually filled its arcades vanished, leaving space where rumour could grow. Historians still argue whether the famous account of a market opening to an empty city represents a single event during plague years, a metaphor for urban decline, or simply a tale spun so often it became treated as fact. Quirky anecdotes sprout in the shadows of this debate. One medieval traveller claims he walked through a colonnaded market where stalls were laden with figs, olives and bolts of indigo cloth, yet he saw not a single buyer. He swore that the merchants stood in place like statues, eyes glazed, waiting for customers who never came. Was he exaggerating for dramatic flair, or did he stumble into a plague-stricken district where fear kept buyers at home? Another tale insists that the emperor himself once ordered a market to open during a time of famine, more for the sake of appearances than for commerce, so that foreign envoys would believe the city still pulsed with life. If true, it is theatre disguised as economics, a pageant of prosperity staged for the eyes of strangers. The emptiness of the market raises unsettling images. Imagine the echo of footsteps in what should be a crowded square, the flutter of pigeons, the only response to a merchant's cry, the bright saffron cloths rippling in wind that no hand reaches out to claim. For a city famed for noise, the chants of monks, the shouts of sellers, the clatter of hooves on stone, the absence itself becomes a character. Absence is louder than presence when it breaks expectation. It unsettles because humans are wired to expect certain rhythms, and when those rhythms falter, imagination rushes to fill the void. Was it plague? Was it fear? Was it a political manipulation? A staged silence? Historians still argue whether the empty market story reflects reality or allegory, but its persistence suggests it struck a deep chord in those who heard it. Religion has always added layers. Some preachers warned that an open market with no buyers was a punishment, a divine sign that greed had emptied the soul of the city. They compared it to biblical famines or to the merchants cast out of the temple, claiming that Constantinople's silence was heaven's rebuke. Others took a gentler view, insisting that the empty market was a reminder that all wealth is transient, that even the busiest bazaar can become a ghostly stage when fortune shifts. One sermon fragment describes the market stalls as open mouths awaiting bread that never comes a line, both poetic and haunting, the kind of phrase that listeners would murmur back to themselves when passing the deserted arcades. The political dimensions of the story cannot be ignored. Emperors and patriarchs alike understood the power of narrative, and an empty market could serve as both warning and weapon. To rivals it showed vulnerability. To allies it invited sympathy. To enemies it whispered of opportunity. Imagine a Venetian merchant returning home to tell his peers, "The Queen of Cities still opens her markets, but they are as barren as the fields of winter." That phrase alone could shift trade routes, tilt negotiations, or embolden raiders. Whether the story was true in fact mattered less than whether it carried weight in ears eager to believe, and humour even in such solemn tales found its corner. One chronicle records a jest. A merchant asked why he kept opening his stall. When no one came, replied that he was waiting for angels who at least would not haggle over prices. Another version has him saying that silence itself was preferable to customers who spent all day bargaining over figs. The laughter such jokes invited did not erase the unease, but it softened it, reminding people that even in times of fear or famine, the human instinct to poke fun remains unquenchable. Over time, the image of Constantinople's empty market detached itself from specific dates or events. It became a floating symbol invoked whenever the empire seemed to falter, whenever plague thinned the streets, whenever walls trembled under foreign banners. A poet likened it to a mirror that reflected not goods but anxieties. Another described it as a theatre where the main character was absence itself. To speak of the empty market was to speak of vulnerability but also of resilience, because the city endured beyond that. Silence repopulated, reopened and reasserted its role as the centre of Mediterranean trade. The market, in other words, was not just a space of goods, but of memory. As the centuries passed and the empire shrank, the story persisted. Even after 1204, when Crusaders sacked the city and Latin merchants filled its stalls with foreign wares, whispers of markets that opened to emptiness continued. And after 1453, when the Ottomans took the city and renamed it Istanbul, the legend followed, retold in different tongues, its meaning shifting like smoke, but never vanishing. Historians still argue whether this continuity proves that the story recorded a genuine event, or whether it simply became a convenient parable of decline. Either way, the flame of the story, much like the eternal fires we've spoken of in other contexts, kept burning in the imagination, outliving the empire itself. Light Joke 1 slides in one tired scribe after recording yet another version of the empty market tale scribbled in the margin. If no one shops, at least the pigeons get plenty of space. His humour feels strangely modern, the sort of comment you might see online beneath a picture of a deserted shopping mall. Light Joke 2 follows gently a courtier quipped that if the market stayed empty much longer, the merchants would have to start selling silence in baskets, priced according to weight. And finally, Light Joke 3 whispered like a wink someone claimed that even ghosts avoided the empty stalls because the prices were too high. Now the story dims into its wind-down stretching, like the final embers of a hearth. The bustling arcades of Constantinople blur into mist, the empty spaces soften into quiet, and the long debates of scholars fade into whispers. The market still stands in imagination, half full, half empty, a paradox preserved not in stone but in story. What began as a rumour has become a lullaby of history, a gentle echo of a city that was once the heart of an empire. The images, slow pigeons cooing in high arches, a single lamp burning low, the faint rustle of wind through abandoned stalls. Breath becomes tied in and out, steady calm. The story no longer demands answers. It simply offers rest, a reminder that mysteries are as much comfort as they are puzzles. The market of Constantinople, open yet empty, remains open still, not for trade but for dreams.